So thank you very much, David, and I'm very honoured to be here to speak to you today. I should declare at the outset that Friedrich Hermann Heinrich Schultze was in fact my great-great-grandfather. So it's a bit of a family history story, but it's also, I think, of interest to people, and I hope that at the end of the session today you'll be able to say something like, well, gee, I didn't know that, or I learned something good today. So, as David said, I'm Polly's husband. She's the pioneer member, having people arrive here in 1839, and a much better historian than I am. I like to thank her for putting me forward to speak today, and also for inviting some of our friends to come along and hear what I have to say. I'd like to thank them for coming. I know that we're on Kaurna land today, but I won't be talking about the Kaurna people. Instead, I'll be talking about the Larrakia people from up in Darwin. Some of them played a very significant role in the expedition to survey Darwin, and in particular in the life of my great-great-grandfather, Friedrich Schultze. A couple of the Larrakia people did visit South Australia in 1870, that's the year after the expedition. And while I can find no evidence about them meeting Kaurna people here, I'm sure that the spirits of the Kaurna people probably welcomed them here, even though they were brought here for what I would consider to be a doubtful purpose, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So, I hope I can work the technology, and I hope you can hear me. So, Friedrich was amongst the greats, really. In 1907, there was an opening address given to the Australian Society for the Advancement of Science by Dr. J.H. Maiden, and he was the director of the New South Wales Botanic Gardens. And his speech was about 100 years of botanical endeavour in South Australia. And you can see some of the names there. I thought 100 years in 1907, surely we'll see some Indigenous people mentioned, but no, not in the speech. But there are some people there. Matthew Flinders, of course, he came through in 1802. Nicholas Baudin, also at the same time. Captain Charles Sturt, and a number of explorers there. Mentioned Father Julian Tennyson Woods, who was a naturalist and collected many specimens. But a number of very important people, if any of you have knowledge of botanical circles or natural history circles, may know of some of these names. So Ferdinand von Mueller, he came to South Australia from Germany. He finished up being the director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. George Bentham, although he spent all his life in England, he wrote a 7-volume book or work entitled Flora Australiensis, which was the most comprehensive story or book about the flora of Australia at that particular time. And he relied on a lot of specimens collected in Australia and sent back to England for him to write and describe that flora. Friedrich Krickhoff was a founder of the Forestry Board in South Australia. Richard Schomburg, some of you may have heard of, director of the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. And Frederick Waterhouse, who was the director of the South Australian Museum. And included in that group was Friedrich Schultze. Now, Friedrich's name hasn't really continued much in the same way that many of those names have, but I wanted to spend today just introducing you to Friedrich, and using him as his story to introduce you or to pass on information about the Goyder Expedition to survey Darwin in 1868 and 69. And in talking, I'll just make a couple of digressions which may be of interest to people here, because there'll be some interesting names that I'll bring up. Okay, now, Hermann Heinrich Friedrich Schultze and his wife Johanna Wilhelmina Maria, née Simon. This is the only authenticated photo that I can find of them. It was taken in about the 1880s Friedrich was in his 80s and Maria, his wife, was in the 60s. Now you can see their baptismal names there, Hermann Heinrich Friedrich Schultze and Johanna Wilhelmina Maria Simon. Now they were known by what's known in German as the Rufname, which is the third name of their baptismal name. So they were known as Friedrich and Maria. To members of his family, he was known as Fred and she was known as Maria. I'll honour them today by talking about Friedrich and Maria using their Rufname. In the early years, Frederick was born in Einbeck in Germany, which is about 100 kilometres south of Hanover. It was renowned through the Middle Ages as being a very prominent beer brewing place and is famous now for Bock beer. There were at one stage, I believe, to be 600 breweries in Einbeck itself, and it's only quite a small town. I've pointed out where you may not be able to see this red dot, but in that house there was the town commandant's house. Now, Einbeck was a garrison town for the Hanoverian army, and Friedrich was born there in 1804 to Dorothea Grosskopf and Sergeant Johann Schultze. Now, Sergeant Johann Schultze was nothing like the Sergeant Schultze that some of you may remember from Hogan's Heroes. I know nothing, but he was a career soldier in the Hanoverian army. I first heard of him. Hanover was ruled by George, or the English kings at that stage, and George III was the one that was most relevant to Friedrich in his time. He was the Elector of Hanover, and the Hanoverian army was sent to India as part of the running of the empire, and Friedrich's father, Johann, found himself in Madras in India in 1783. He was only about 14 at the time, so he must have been maybe like a bugle boy or something like that with the Hanoverian army. And then he spent quite some time there before coming back and landing back in Einbeck. Napoleon occupied Hanover in 1804, and so the Hanoverian army was, members of that who wished to were offered by George III to move to England and form what was called the King's German Legion. And this was a legion of German soldiers who moved to Bexhill in Sussex, and they fought on the side of the British in the Napoleonic Wars. Friedrich's father, Johann, fought with the English in Copenhagen, the Battle of Copenhagen, the Peninsular Wars, went to Sicily, Flanders, Belgium, and then in 1816, the King's German Legion was disbanded, and so Johann, Dorothea, and all the family moved back to Germany. However, while in Bexhill, when they moved to Bexhill, they had 4 children, and they had another 6 children in Bexhill. And so this is just the uniforms of the King's German Legion. And so Friedrich, my great-great-grandfather, was in Bexhill from the age of 2 until he was 12. And he did his schooling at the Bexhill School. And his siblings, we've seen records of his siblings who were born in Bexhill who were baptised in the church there, St. Peter's Church. At the time that the King's German Legion was in Bexhill in Sussex, which is not too far from Hastings, where the Battle of Hastings was held in 1066, there were only about a population only of about 1,000 in Bexhill, but there were up to 5,000 soldiers from the King's German Legion there. So you can see it was a very significant contribution to the town of Bexhill at the particular time. It's during this time when Friedrich was there in Bexhill that you can be pretty confident, I think, that he learnt to speak English. and that stood him in good stead when he finally emigrated to Australia. Okay, before emigration to Australia, Friedrich, after leaving England, qualified as an apothecary in Germany. An apothecary was, at that time, was a person who went around collecting plants and exploring the medicinal features of plants to be able to prescribe them to people who were ill. He also became a senior manager in a sugar mill in Germany. He married and had 5 children, and his wife died after that. Now, I'll mention here, because it gives a bit of an insight into Friedrich himself, a pretty single-minded person. When he did emigrate to Australia, I found no evidence of him making contact with his 5 children from his first marriage. And members of his family, some of whose grandparents knew Friedrich and actually had lived with him, none of them even knew that he had 5 children by his first marriage. I've been able to trace them through the wonders of ancestry and the internet now, and I know that where they died, and there's no evidence that any of those ever came to Australia to catch up with Friedrich at all. So, left that life behind him. He did marry a second time, no children from that, but was divorced. And then he married Wilhelmina Johanna Maria Simon in 1849 before emigrating to Australia in 1850. And they emigrated from Bremen in Germany on the ship the Leontine. Maria was pregnant when they boarded and gave birth to a child on the boat, the first daughter, and she was called Leontina after the name of the ship, the Leontine. Now, when they arrived in Adelaide, within 17 days of arrival, they had purchased land at a place called Buxfelde, which is, some of you may have heard of, on the Gawler River. And you can see here, maybe, all the way through here is the Gawler River. And he bought some land, like a block of land, a section of land, section 52 up there, I think it was, where it was divided into 3 pieces. Biswinkle was on the same Leontine boat as Friedrich, so they may have sort of formed a relationship on the boat and went and bought this particular land. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Buxfelde, it's a very interesting settlement. It's not as well known as a German settlement as Harndorf and Klemzig and others. And this was quite a small settlement on the Gawler River, set up largely to model the sort of country villages that they would have occupied in Germany. But some of the key people who came there came out on the Princess Louise in 1849. And the Princess Louise ship brought a lot of dissidents and intellectuals from Germany to Australia because they were dissatisfied with the political situation in Germany at the time. Some of them had in fact been imprisoned for their opposition to that regime in place at the time, and they came out here and settled in Buxfelde. Some of the names that came on the Princess Louise and settled there, you probably heard of Karl Linger, who composed the melody for the Song of Australia. The words were, I think, invented or composed by Christine Carlton, but Karl Linger composed the melody of that. Karl Mucke was one of the first newspaper proprietors in South Australia, and other people who settled there were Richard Schomburg. You can see directly, virtually diagonally across the Gawler River from where Friedrich Schultze was. And another name I'll mention now was Baron Hermann von Rieben. And I just ask you to note those names because I'll come back and talk about them later. Both of them probably played an important part in the life of Friedrich. Now, While he was at Gawler River, he took off. Friedrich went over to the goldfields for a short time. I think it was quite unsuccessful, came back. But then he started collecting. And the first real evidence of his collecting was in the first anniversary of the establishment of the Gawler Institute, which was set up, among other people, by Dr. Richard Schomburg. And Friedrich showed some stuffed birds at that exhibition in 1858. And then during the 1960s, I've managed to go through a lot of the board minutes of the South Australian Museum, and it's just amazing the proliferation of specimens that Friedrich collected and supplied to the museum. I think he probably made much more money out of supplying specimens to the museum than he made off of his farm, which was at this stage located out at St Kitts, between Kapunda and Udunda. So he spent a lot of time collecting at the Norwest Bend, which is just near Morgan, where Morgan is now. And he would have spent, it's 90 kilometres from where he lived, and he didn't ride a horse, so he would have taken a dray or a cart with him. And so he's away for about 2 weeks at a time, maybe, while he was collecting. In 1867, for the South Australian Museum, you can see it was recorded in the board minutes that he provided 117 birds, 89 small animals. Many other collectors provided samples, but only small numbers, and one of them recorded there was Father Tennyson Woods. So he started getting very interested in collecting at this particular stage, but did spend quite a lot of time away from home. So I just now like to talk about my first digression. You remember on the map of I'll just go back a couple. Here, Baron Hermann von Rieben purchased land adjacent to where Friedrich had purchased his land. Now, in the mid-1850s, 1855, Baron Hermann von Rieben went up and established the Norwest Bend Hotel, which is just south of Morgan. And it's now on the Burn Vineyards property up there. 3 years ago, Polly and I went up and visited the place. This is all that's left of the hotel. There is a graveyard there for Hermann von Rieben, the Baron, and his wife Louisa. They had some children up there. He ran a sheep run up there. Interestingly enough, one of the people who worked for him on the sheep run was Charles Rasp, who then went on and found Broken Hill, the silver lead ores at Broken Hill. Now, Baron Hermann von Rieben's son, and they came from quite a large baronetcy, I suppose you call it, in Germany, with a large manor, and then finished up at Norwest Bend building this stone hotel. And it was on the trip from Wentworth to Adelaide for droving cattle. So it was quite a popular stopover point on the way through. One of his sons that was born there was Otto von Rieben. And Otto, knowing Charles Rasp, went to Broken Hill and made quite a bit of money in Broken Hill. Then in 1906, he came and bought that big mansion on Kensington Road called Atunga, which is now, in 1944, he and his wife had no children. So he shifted to Pomona in the Adelaide Hills at Stirling, and he donated the property, Atunga, to the Burnside Council for use as a community hospital on the proviso that the gardens and the mansion were maintained. And you can still see that now. So the link, it's interesting, we talk about, people say, oh, that's South Australia, you know people and that sort of thing. Well, this is just an interesting little connection from Friedrich buying property next to Hermann von Rieben, and probably when he went to Northwest Bend, staying in the Hermann von Rieben Hotel, and then Otto donating the mansion to to the Burnside Council. Now let's talk about the Goyder Expedition. This is in 1868-69. And George Goyder was the Surveyor General of South Australia, and he was the leader of the expedition. Now, his was the fourth survey expedition necessary to establish the city of Darwin. In the early 60s, there was a tug of war between South Australia and Queensland as to who would have responsibility for the Northern Territory. And eventually, the responsibility for the Northern Territory was allocated to South Australia. And there were a number of land investors who had put down deposits for land in the Northern Territory, and they were wanting to be able to get title to their land to be able to either utilise it or to sell it. And so the government was under quite a lot of pressure to have it surveyed. They sent up the initial survey with Boyle Travers Finnis in 1864 rather, and many of you will have heard of Boyle Travers Finnis. He arrived on Kangaroo Island, I think it was about in August of 1836, so before the buffalo arrived in Adelaide. But his survey ended in acrimony. He found a place where he thought it might be ideal, which was on marshland and mangroves and swampy. It was on a river, the Adelaide River, but it was really not a very good piece of land. And he and his favourites got into arguments at times with people on his party who weren't in his favourite circle. Anyway, there was a bit of a mutiny there. Some of his team left, and then the government, not being happy, sent McKinley up in the next year, 1865. Now, McKinley was an explorer who set out to look for Burke and Wills, and he was the second person, I believe, to travel from south to north across the continent of Australia by foot after John McDowell Stewart. He also then went across to Queensland and came back, but McKinley went up there, and his survey expedition was also a bit of a failure because he didn't find land that was deemed suitable. He also took orders up to Finnis, where Finnis was recalled to go back to Adelaide to face a royal commission because the initial survey that Finnis was leading was deemed to be a failure. So in 1867, the government sent Captain Cadell, who was prominent in the River Murray trade, up there by boat, and he was to explore the coast to try and find a better site for Palmerston or the capital of the Northern Territory. And he mapped the coast, came back, and after that, the government, I guess in maybe a desperation, went to George Goyder and said, we'd like you to lead a survey up there to establish this area. And everybody I think knows George Goyder except some of our friends who we've spoken to, and they say, well, who was George Goyder? Have you ever heard of him? But anyway, he was deemed the person who could do it. He took charge of it because he said, okay, I will do it, but you have to pay me a good amount of money before I leave. And when I come back successfully, you pay me another good amount of money, and I choose all the people that I take with me. I decide what sort of equipment, what sort of facilities I'll need, and leave it in my hands. So on the 23rd of December, a party of 138 sailed from Port Adelaide on a ship called the Moonta. They actually sailed from the port out into the Port River, but because of tides, they couldn't go any further. So they spent Christmas Day on the boat in the Port River, all except for one person, the doctor. The surgeon, Dr. Peel, he was able to go back and spend Christmas with his family, but all the rest of the crew, they had to spend their time on the boat in the Port River. So included in the party was Friedrich Schultze. Now, Friedrich Schultze had been nominated by Richard Schomburg, who, as you remember, had the land diagonally across the Gawler River from him, and who had worked with him in the Goyder Institute, displaying some of his collections. He nominated Friedrich and was supported by Ferdinand von Mueller, who was the director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, and Frederick Waterhouse, who was the director of the South Australian Museum. He was also accompanied by his son, Alfred, Frederick's son, who was 16 years old. After a 41-day voyage, they anchored in Darwin Harbour, what is now Darwin Harbour, and they were greeted by First Nations people, and the party could not believe their ears. According to both First Nations oral history and the European oral history, they could hear, "John Brown's body lies a mouldering in his grave." And what had happened was the Aboriginal people had learnt this song from previous British garrisons who'd been camped up there, and also the previous survey expeditions. And it was a popular song, obviously sung around a campfire, and the Aboriginal people, as they were paddling out to greet them, were singing John Brown's body. They probably thought this was another ship of these white people who were coming here to land, might be spent 3 months here and go off like all the other ships have, but they didn't realise that this was for keeps this time. Anyway, Friedrich and his son were in the first boat to go ashore from the ship. They were obviously very keen to start collecting. On the way up, George Goyder, to keep people occupied, organised for a newspaper to be prepared. It was a 6-page newspaper. It was all handwritten at that particular time, but someone's obviously typeset it now, and it's searchable on Trove. So you can actually search the Moonta Herald and the Northern Territory Gazette on Trove. There's some very humorous and interesting, 6 issues were published, very humorous and interesting comments in there. So one comment was reportedly from Adelaide, of course it wasn't, but since the departure of the Northern Territory Expedition, the young ladies of the Theatre Royal have been in deep mourning. Another one, the business at the billiard saloon has been very dull. Now, Friedrich wrote an article in for this newspaper on the Portuguese man of war because they were catching them over the side of the ship. And at one stage, he also acted as a judge, a chief judge for a mock criminal trial which they held on the boat. For Goyder was trying to keep the morale up and so on. Now, this is on the left of your screen is a map of the Goyder camp in 1869 with the black dots showing the buildings. And then on the right is a photograph of what is known now as Goyder Park, which was set up in 2019 for the sesquicentenary of the arrival of Goyder in Darwin. And they had quite a celebration there to open this park. And apparently those concrete blocks that you can see with grass in are supposed to be where many of the buildings in the Goyder camp were. I was fortunate enough to be there for that sesquicentenary celebration. I was the only descendant of anybody from that expedition to be able to be there, so it was quite moving actually to see and to walk the ground that Friedrich had walked. Now, conditions in Darwin were pretty terrible. I have to read from the screen because my reading here, I can read from this screen. So this is Goyder talking about how he would keep people moving. He said, "I found from actual experience that unless the men had a stimulant early in the morning, they could not eat their breakfast. And also they could not eat their dinner unless they first had a stimulant. I worked as they did and found out whatever was required when the fits of lassitude came and treated them accordingly." And bear in mind, they arrived in February, which is in the wet season, which is terrible up there if you're unused to it. Rain fell heavily. What with mosquitoes and the rain and the heat, fits of lassitude would come over me and I had little inclination to work. With stimulants, men can work, but take them away and they utterly fail. the stimulants used by the party contained alcohol. They never would have got the work done without it. So yeah. Yeah. Okay, it was a very successful survey because over a period of 7 months or so, they surveyed over 700,000 acres, 2,700 square kilometres, and the main party left Darwin in September in 1869, having arrived there in February. So they worked really, really hard, and some of the crew were left up there to continue and finalise some of the survey, and also to prepare for the overland telegraph, which was being set up in the following year, 1870. Now, there's a quote from Goyder about what he got a lot of fun out of this quote from a First Nations person describing with puzzlement the overland telegraph. He said, the Aboriginal said, "What plurry fool white fella put up this one fella fence? It no stop 'em horse," because the poles were so far apart. Anyway, while they were up there, they managed to name a number of places to commemorate people from South Australia or people on the party. So Francis Bay, which is the largest bay in Darwin, and Stokes Bay is part of Francis Bay, if you know Darwin at all. Goyder's first wife was Frances Smith, so that was named after her. Fanny Bay was named after Fanny Corandini, who was an opera singer, which the crew, the expedition party had visited a recital of hers not long before they boarded the ship in Adelaide, and so I think they were obviously quite impressed with Fanny. Some of the travel authorities up in Darwin will say that Fanny Bay, which is famous for its race course and for its prison, was named after Francis Goyder, but it wasn't. It was named after Fanny Corandini. There's a Schultze Street there named after my great-great-grandfather Friedrich Schultze, and there's also Mount Schultze, which is on the just on the southwest corner of Kakadu. Now, to call it a mount is enhancing it with a great deal of glory because it's more sort of a slight rise in the terrain, but it nevertheless is named after Friedrich. Many others in the party were commemorated, but one to mention is the Smith family, because they were Goyder's in-laws. And I'll just digress again, move over the photo of me at the Schultze Street. The second digression I want to make is that Goyder married Frances Smith, that was his first wife, and had a number of children with her, and she was quite sickly. And when he went to Darwin, she went back to England with her sister Ellen, and we took the children with them. And while Goyder was in Darwin, unfortunately Frances died in England. And Goyder didn't hear about this until he got back to Adelaide in November of 1869. He then went on and married Frances' sister Ellen, which was apparently quite common to marry, a sister of the first wife if she died. However, Frances and Ellen's sister Mahala was 1 year younger than Frances, and Mahala married John Bailey Isaac in the St John's Church that David spoke about earlier, not the one that's there now, but the original one, St John's in the Wilderness, in 1851. And Polly is a first cousin 4 times removed of John Bailey Isaac, who married Mahala Smith. So it's one of this sort of, well, that's South Australia again when you talk about it. So I just thought I'd throw that in as a sort of a bit of a digression. Now, Friedrich in Darwin. So he was 64 when he arrived in Darwin. Now, I was close to retirement when I was 64, but he went up there and started this work. He was by far the oldest in the group up there. Some of the surveyors, the younger surveyors, described him as being in his dotage. He was 22 years older than Goyder at the time, and he didn't keep a diary, but he did write one letter to a German newspaper in Tanunda, and this is his words: "The heat here is terrible, so the garments do not get dry. Yes, you can wring the sweat out. Towards evening, when you want to enjoy the coolness, thousands of mosquitoes and sandflies tear off the blood that has become thin by the heat, leaving a painful lesion of the skin which later turns into blisters. Then there's the prickly heat, a terrible plague, and many suffer so much their whole skin is raw meat. There are plenty of pus bumps. Some people are so badly affected by these that the bone is pushing out of the wounds." And bear in mind, they're going through spear grass to survey, and spear grass is sort of very tough, very hard, and it's sort of sometimes 2 metres, 2.5 metres tall. So we're lucky to have something from Friedrich in his own words, but it's not a very inspiring piece. He was a prodigious collector up there. It was difficult to preserve many of these samples because of the heat, and there was no refrigeration.
More than 1,000 different plant species. We happen to have
16 copies of each of the species that he collected. 800 bird skins, and Waterhouse, Frederick Waterhouse from the South Australian Museum, sent some of those skins to John Gould, who was the artist, said to be the artist, although it was believed that his wife was the artist, and John Gould claimed a lot of the credit for that. Shells, fish, a small crocodile, insects, wood specimens, Aboriginal artefacts, including a canoe, a crocodile, all in all over 150 cases of material that he collected up there. Many of those specimens then were exchanged with universities and museums and other places overseas. So I've listed some of them there. More than half of the specimens that he collected are still held in the Melbourne Herbarium at the Melbourne Botanic Garden, but nothing in Adelaide. So there's not even rocks or wood specimens or anything like that. It's non-perishable, found in the South Australian Museum or the Botanic Gardens Herbarium or anything like that. So many of them were quite new to science, and it's surprising that none of them survived here in Adelaide. Being done by William Hoare, who was one of the survey party, but he was also an artist, and he painted this painting as an image of one of the crabs that Friedrich had collected when he was in Darwin. And in 2019, when I was up there for the sesquicentenary, the government put on an exhibition which had not so much the animals, but they did have 4 plants. They had samples of Friedrich's collection with side by side with paintings by William Hoare of the same plant, which he did while he was on the expedition. So it was quite interesting to see those. There were 11 plant species named after Friedrich. They're listed there, I won't go through them all. And there were 43 type specimens that he collected. Now, type specimens are like the Greenwich Mean Time, if you like, for natural history specimens. So they are the ones that they're a permanent reference for worldwide identification of a plant, just to check and see whether it is that plant or another one. So 43 of the specimens that he collected were type specimens. Now, Polly and I had the opportunity to visit Kew Gardens Herbarium, Royal Kew Gardens, and this is one of the samples that he collected in Darwin. It's an Indigofera schultziana, so it's named after him, collected by him, and this here, in this area here, is Friedrich Schultze's handwriting from the notes from when he collected it. We also went to Melbourne and saw specimens there that Friedrich had collected. And this is a type specimen, also named after Friedrich, a Schultzianer, and it's annotated by Friedrich von Müller, who was one of the people who sponsored him to go to Darwin. I've only recently discovered too that some of his bird specimens, type bird specimens, so these are specimens that were worldwide sample for comparison, are exhibited in the Tring Museum in Hertfordshire in England. So these are two bird skins. These are not the bird skins, but these are the birds that Friedrich managed to get the skins of, send them back to Adelaide, and they found their way to Tring in England. Now, this is a view, a photograph of the Goyder camp in Darwin. This, I'll go back, this hill here was called Fort Hill, and it no longer exists. This has been bulldozed, and it's quite flat there. Over in that part of on the left of your screen is what's known now as Stokes Bay, where the wharf is with the restaurants on the end of it. And this was bulldozed with the idea of putting a Chinese consortium putting a 5-star, 6-star hotel there looking out over the sea. It hasn't been built yet, but it's bare land. But behind that Fort Hill is where the cruise ship terminal is for Darwin now. So this is a little gully here between Fort Hill, and up here above the foreground of the picture is where the city of Darwin is. And if you've been to Darwin, you might know the government house up there with the picket fence. That's at the top of the hill from where this photo was taken. Now, Friedrich's tent, you'll see there, was set apart from the camp because it was a rather unsavoury place. He would collect all these animals, skin them, and it smelt. And so they said, leave, we can't have you in the camp. It's just too smelly and not very pleasant. Now this is a blown up of that photograph, and you can see there's maybe you can see there's a man out the front here of the tent, and I don't know whether that's Friedrich or not, but I'll take it that it might be. Anyway, being in the tent, he had animals that he'd skinned and carcasses and things like that. And one day he nearly got into trouble because a group of First Nations people came up looking for what they call tum-tum, because he had animal carcasses, food, and they threatened him with spears. And this First Nations person called Billiamuk, he managed to come in and tell them, the other First Nations people, no, don't do that, go away. These people are friendly. And Billiamuk happened to be in one of the canoes on the first time that the ship landed in Darwin in February. So he was quite familiar with, and he'd been involved with the earlier survey parties as well. He dissuaded Schultze also from pulling his revolver out saying, no, not good, not good. And there's a suburb in Darwin that's named after him, Bellamac. Now, in 1870, he and two other Larrakia people were brought to Adelaide, and you can see I've arrowed Billiamuk there. They were brought down by McKinley, Davis and Day. And McKinley, that's the same McKinley who did the second survey in Darwin. And if you read that, they were brought to Adelaide to impress them with the number and power of the race which had taken possession of their land, and thus convinced the local Aboriginal people to desist from hostilities. I thought, what? Anyway, the unfortunate thing was that Daly, McKinsey and Davis paid to bring them down here, but then refused to pay to send them back. So some people, good-hearted people in South Australia at the time, ran a subscription, but also got the government to put some money in so that these three Larrakia people could go back. Now, just a few extracts from Goyder's diary. Early on, he was a bit sceptical, I think, about having Friedrich on the expedition with him, because he said in the 29th of January, while they were still sailing up there, "Mr. Schultze is merely a collector and preserver of plants and animals. Perhaps this is better, as he cannot be carried away by enthusiasm." But then later on, he talks about, "It was unfortunate that Mr. Schultze could not accompany me on my inland journeys, he being unaccustomed to horse exercise. A large amount of information was therefore lost to me. I endeavoured to counteract this loss by sending him inland with the drays, when he generally reaped rich harvests and got into ecstasies with every new prize." So, just want to say now, what about Maria, Friedrich's wife? Now, they lost a baby, Hugo, at birth in 1857 while they were at St Kitts. She was left on her own a lot while Friedrich was away collecting in South Australia and also at the goldfields. And then she was left to manage the farm while Friedrich was away in Darwin for 2 years, because Friedrich stayed on beyond the time of the major party coming back. She was looking after 5 children. The youngest of them was 3 years old. And was she lonely in a strange land? I don't know. But I did come across this quote put together by Ian Harmsdorf, who's a German historian here in South Australia, and it was a quote from a woman who lived in Lindok, or near Lindok. And she says, "Most of the time, I am with you all in the homeland. Despite the fact that this land is so beautiful, one still doesn't feel at home. At least I don't. I've been here for over 10 years, and I feel just as strange and foreign as if I'd just arrived. After my sister left, a great gap appeared in my life. With her, I could talk about you, my dear ones at home, and I could endure the crippling loneliness. In my mind now, I often wander with you around the house and see you doing your different tasks. When I tell you that my thoughts wander about the old home, I don't just mean the house, I mean the whole village. In my mind, I wander through the church, the school, and over the mountains and the paths. I see everything just as I knew it, just as I left it." So maybe Maria might have felt lonely, I don't know. But Friedrich, as you can see, he spent a lot of time single-mindedly collecting. I'd just like to digress now for the third time. Emma Caroline Schultze was a daughter of Friedrich and Maria. She was born in 1854 in the Gawler River at Buxfelde. She married Karl Alexander Rudolf Methke in 1869 at the age of 15. 1869, Friedrich was away in Darwin. Karl was 35, 20 years difference. Now, when Friedrich and Maria got married, there was a 20-year difference between them. He was 42, she was 22. So maybe it wasn't that much of a problem for Maria. She did write a letter to Friedrich in Darwin asking for permission for this marriage to go ahead, but with the communications, the ships going back and forth, he didn't get it, and he didn't get a chance to write back until after the marriage. But they got married in November of 1869 while Friedrich was still away. Now, Karl Methke is a very interesting person. He was born in Prussia and travelled to Australia, spent some time in the Bendigo goldfields, and then he took off and was crewing ships all around the world. In 1862, he found himself in San Francisco, and he fought in the American Civil War on the side of Abraham Lincoln. In 1866, he returned to South Australia and into the teaching profession. And then he became a teacher at St Kitts, where Maria and the farm was located. He had 10 children with Emma, and the family quote is that he was a strict disciplinarian, discouraging unworthy suitors of his daughters with a stockwhip, and none of his daughters ever married. Now, but many of you will have heard of Adelaide Methke. Now, Adelaide Methke was one of the 6th child of Rudolf and Emma. So she was Friedrich's granddaughter and, accordingly, my first cousin twice removed. So her So Friedrich was her grandfather, he's my great-great-grandfather. Now, Adelaide Mithke, very famous person here in South Australia, particularly a woman before her time, I would say. She spent 12 years as secretary of and president of the Women's Teachers Progressive League from 1912. During World War I, she raised £250,000, that's a lot of money in those days, for the Children's Patriotic Fund. She was put in charge of a whole lot of new schools for girls, became, I think, the first female inspector of schools in South Australia, president of the National Council of Women. In World War II, once again, took on the director of the Schools Patriotic Fund. And the money that was left over from that went towards developing the Women's Remembrance Gardens in Pennington Gardens opposite the Torrens Parade Ground. And she developed the School of the Air with John Flynn. She came up with the notion that they could use the pedal radios on outback stations. And this year is, in fact, the 75th year anniversary of the School of the Air. So she was a very notable person, and she's remembered on the North Terrace walks. Now, after Darwin, Friedrich tended to opt out of collecting altogether. It seemed that really he was motivated more by the number and the scope of things that he could collect. He's very single-minded about all these sorts of things, and personal recognition or being recorded for posterity didn't seem to matter to him. He just disappeared. There was a police officer in Darwin who took over collecting a lot of specimens for the South Australian Museum. His name was Paul Fulcher, and he was up there. He arrived there before Friedrich left Darwin, and he was hoping to take over and get some advice from Friedrich about, where to go and what hadn't been collected and where and so on. He kept writing to Friedrich, and Friedrich didn't answer any of his letters. So Friedrich just decided, right, that's done, I'm moving on to the next thing. And then, so he took up a land grant up near South Gulnare, where he lived for around 20 years. Incidentally, he went away with his son Alfred, and he and Alfred set up to farm this property together. And when Alfred then wanted to leave and take his share of the farm and set up his own farm, Friedrich refused to give him any money. So Alfred then had to take Friedrich to court to try and get his just dues, because he wasn't paid anything, he was just given board on this farm with his wife. So Friedrich was, as I said, single-minded. When his wife Maria died, he shifted to Black Rock near Orroroo to work with my great-grandmother, Frederica Rodigiro, who ran their general store at Black Rock, which is near Orroroo. He became a Catholic at age 96 in 1900. Just in time. Now, Hermann Mithke, which was her grandson, so one of Rudolf, Karl and Emma's sons, remembered Friedrich as being a terrific smoker. He smoked a pipe from early morning until late at night. When he awoke in the morning, the first thing he did was put a pipe in his mouth. He smoked at night, and after he was asleep, my aunt, who was my grandmother, would go into his room and gently remove the pipe from his mouth. The story is she also in the morning used to have to empty his chamber pot and his spittoon as well. Wasn't very pleasant, but it was then about, Hermann Mithke was then about 18 or 19. He couldn't understand why a young man my age didn't smoke a pipe. From what he said, he must have been smoking when he was very, very young. So Friedrich died on the 22nd of August 1902, aged 98. He's buried in the Orroroo Cemetery in an unmarked grave. And one of my projects for this year is to try and get some sort of memento on that grave, just to sort of indicate who he was and what sort of things he accomplished. So I thank you for being a good audience, and I hope that you learned something that you didn't know before. Thank you very much.